It's David Swinowski here with Rubble Road Soapstone Kits. Today we're going to have some fun carving the small duck or loon. We're going to use 3 simple pieces of sandpaper to do this carving here today. So join me today and let's have some fun carving. All right, welcome. My name's David. Today we're going to have the fun of carving the small loon or the duck. So we have the basic silhouette here. We're going to use the tools provided. We're going to do our carving primarily on one side or the other here today. For those of you who have not carved soapstone before, you can actually feel this stone and you might actually feel why they call it soapstone. It's the texture of this rock that gives it its name. There is no soap in here. I will not be making bubbles in this bin with water here today. I'm just going to be carving the softest rock out there. You can actually scratch that with your thumbnail. That's a pretty soft stone if you can scratch it with your thumbnail. So in those little sanding packs here, we're going to start off by using that very coarse mesh that's inside. With the mesh here, you're going to find that this is just a fabric with some grit glued to it. So just using these edges on their own is not going to be sufficient to really shape and carve the stone. We recommend that you fold it up and use that folded edge to do your primary shaping on the stone. I personally like to try and carve mine more realistically. We're going to carve a neckline, create a wing. For this particular shape today, we might narrow that beak a little bit, get the cheeks to stand out somewhat. With the soapstone carving, and with most stone carving, you would find that you're not adding any stone, you're only taking stone away. So because of that, we want to try and think about the aspects of our carving that we actually want to stick out the most. So I want the wing to stick out primarily on this particular carving. So I'm going to focus a lot of my carving in on the front chest of the bird, on the body underneath, and also creating a nice round head and then narrowing that beak as well. So with the stone carving, we're going to use this sandpaper almost like a saw, carving in, creating some of our grooves here. You can do this to create the neckline as well. 1 or 2 scrubs is not going to be enough. We have a metamorphic rock here, and because of that, not every single piece of soapstone that you're going to carve is going to be exactly the same. If it's a softer piece of soapstone, you're going to be able to make these carving grooves in 15, 20 scrubs. But if you have a harder, denser piece of stone, it might take 50, 60 scrubs to make that same depth of detail in a harder rock. So the trade-off is softer rocks, easier to shape, harder stones. Once we actually go to sandpaper 2 and 3 and we begin to polish these stones, it's actually going to be a significant difference in the softness that we can actually get on the stone itself, just with these second and third pieces of sandpaper here today. But because we're removing stone, we're not adding any at all. We're actually going to be using the water as the garbage can for this. So I like to actually dip the rock in there, get everything wet before I really get into carving. That way it's more of a paste than a powder. As far as depth of details, we want to make sure that any of the patterns we are carving into this stone are deep enough, because once we go to sandpaper number 2, when we begin to smooth out the scratches that we've left behind, if our patterns aren't deep enough into that rock, they will get erased with sandpaper number 2. So I'm just going to try and hold this at an angle that you can actually see. Try and find a spot that's going to focus on that. So with the depth of the stone here, I don't need to go halfway into my stone. If I go halfway into that rock, I'm doing a little bit more work than I need to, but we should be able to kind of grip that groove pattern that you're creating with like a fingernail or a thumbnail. There should be a significant groove in that stone. You would want to be able to see that as well from a distance, right? So that's what we're kind of looking for our groove patterns. And I like to also make sure that there's the same depth all the way across, not deeper on one side and then shallower on the other. So if I find that I'm just going in one direction and it's deeper on one side than it is on the other, I'll just turn that whole stone around and I'll just trace that same line from the opposite angle to help even out that groove pattern that I made in the stone. One other thing we're going to want to do here today is get rid of the tooling marks that are created when we're working on this stone. When we use the bandsaw to cut these shapes out, the bandsaw leaves a light striping pattern on the stone. Even if I'm not going to shape that, for example, on the other opposite side of my stone here, the flat side, I'm still going to scuff it up and start to bring out those natural colors that are in the rock. You can see them really start to kind of pop out there. If you see that gray striping pattern on your stone, and it could be in a different direction than this particular piece right now, but right now I've got it kind of going from the top down towards the bottom. You can see those little gray patches sticking out. I want to scrub my stone until those are gone. All right. You don't want to over sand though. You don't want to keep on scrubbing your rock until it's nothing but a wafer. You just want to get rid of those tooling marks. And I like to open up my sandpaper, covers more surface area. That way it's a lot more effective at carving and getting rid of those tooling marks. So that looks pretty good. That's the surface and the texture I'm really going to want all over my rock to ensure that when I go to sandpaper number 2, it's going to be a much easier transition going into the smooth texture once we've actually gotten rid of the tooling marks. And I'm going to get rid of those tooling marks everywhere on my stone. Not just on the flat side where I'm not carving, not just on the main side where I'm carving my patterns, but anywhere I want to see those natural colors coming out. And I might have a little bit of shaping to do to help round off the head to make it a little bit rounder. You know, might have cutting a round shape on the bandsaw in the stone isn't the easiest thing to do. So I might want to just finesse and just make that a little bit rounder for my own personal preference. All right. You can just do that by slowly grinding around. Just working on that stone, right? Also making sure I get rid of those tooling marks on the main side as well, all over. I really want to make sure I'm getting rid of that gray haziness on the stone itself, right? Because that's going to stop the natural colors from coming through once we go to sandpaper 2. So just lay that down, scuff it up. All on the top thinner sides as well. Underneath. The soapstone that we use in our kits is from Brazil. We enjoy ordering the stone from Brazil, even though we do have a couple of Canadian areas that we can get it from. Primarily with the range of color that we get from the Brazilian stone, we really enjoy that. We've actually gone through over 1 million pounds of stone from Brazil in the last 15 years. And we still get to see some new colors from this place. So that's what we really, really enjoy about it. And right now I'm narrowing the beak. So I'm just focusing on the beak. I actually want the cheeks or the round head on my duck to stick out a little bit more. So I'm really trying to stay away from carving into the face of my duck. I just want to make the beak a little bit narrower. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to try and make sure that the beak is roughly the same depth or the same thickness all the way across. Constant pressure, constant contact, just scrubbing into that stone. Sorry, I'll try and get that back into the camera. Constant pressure, constant contact, scrubbing into that rock, whittling away, if you will, creating a little bit of depth. And the narrower this beak becomes, the more the cheek of my duck is going to stick out, right? That's not bad. That's a pretty good start for right now. So now I'm just going to try and make sure it's the same depth or the same thickness all the way across. All right, and now I'm going to get to start work on my wing shape. So I'm going to try and bring my sandpaper all the way down. I like to leave a little bit extra at the back, more like for the duck tail feathers. So I kind of carve all the way across the back end of that duck. But then I'm going to start to bring and curve to create that wing shape on the main body of the duck here. So coming around, and I do find curves are probably one of the hardest things to do. And I do try and kind of match the wing curve, the beginning of the wing, if you will, up with roughly the back of the head of my duck. So I'm going to try and curve it up so it meets roughly at the back of the head of that duck. If you want, you can put a little groove to start, just to give you a visual marker of where you're going to go to, and then bring that around. So now that I have this created, I want that wing to stick out a little bit more. So I'm going to carve into the chest or the body of this duck. I'm leaving that wing alone as I'm scrubbing all the way around it, right? And the more I do this, the more that wing shape is going to really kind of stand out on this particular carving. Back and forth and back and forth. Make sure you're doing lots of rinsing with this sandpaper. As it clogs up with dust, it's just not as effective. So I'm kind of like an otter, always rinsing stuff off in the bin. All right. And right back to it. And if I still see I have some gray tooling marks there, quick little scuff. That's all it's going to take, right? I like using my thumb technique as well, where I just use my thumb and push the sandpaper around with my thumb. It's actually amazing how much strength and pressure you can get in a small, concentrated area just by using your thumb. So it's a great way to work in a small, confined area. Choo, 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 choo. Making sure I rinse it. Gonna round those cheeks a little bit more. They're a little bit square and blocky there. I really want to have a nice roundish face on this particular duck or loon here today. And I want to get rid of a little bit more rock in here to really help kind of bring this down and smooth it around to really help the head stick out. So I'm actually going to fold my sandpaper multiple times to make it a smaller, thicker piece of sandpaper. All right, it's going to be a little bit more rigid now. I can really use this to dig in and really chew into that stone. And with those varying colors that we get from this rock from Brazil, we get varying shades of brown, light browns to dark browns, varying shades of green, light greens to dark greens, combinations of these colors, greens and browns together. And if you're going to do any amount of soapstone carving, you would typically find that the lighter colored stones are softer and the darker colored stones are harder. The only exception to that would be if the lighter colored stone may have a higher iron content in it. So if there's any brownish color in your stone at all, that's from the iron content oxidizing or rusting, turning that surrounding stone that brownish color. You may also have some black spots in your stone. Those black spots would also be pieces of iron that just haven't kind of corroded or oxidized or rusted away. They're just trapped inside your rock. Typically, the iron content in here is quite small, the pieces themselves being quite small, where you would not be able to use a magnet or anything to pick them up. They're really quite tiny. But occasionally, in the really darker stone, you might actually get enough heat and pressure in that metamorphic process that iron can form its crystal inside of soapstone. And the crystal form of iron is usually a square or a cube Looks like gold, but if you took it to a jeweler or anyone to get a ring made, they may call you a fool because it's also known as fool's gold. So iron pyrite can form in this stone. So again, just really concentrating my efforts around that wing, right? Trying to help make the cheeks of the duck stick out a little bit more, and that wing to also kind of stick out a little bit more. Rinsing it off. Gonna look for any more tooling marks that I might want to get rid of as well. And I'll just quickly get rid of those. And I do find by staying above my bucket, it's going to help trap the majority of the water that drips out and make my cleanup a lot easier to do when I'm finished here. When I'm done, I'll just have to clean up the bin that I'm using. So now for the back of my duck, I have that wing kind of sticking out, but the back is still very square, still very blocky. I'm also going to want to round this off a little bit as well, just like the back of a duck would be. So I'm also going to use my sandpaper. I'll open it up a little bit, and I'm just going to push right on those square blocky edges and focus my work on that square blocky corner so that as I kind of carve it away, it'll start to naturally round that off. All right. Rounding that wing shape. Lots of rinsing, double checking, looking for any of those gray stripes as I go. So now that I've kind of rounded the back of the wing off, I'm also going to kind of round off the edges and soften those up along the head of the duck or the loon as well. All right. I don't need it super, super square. I don't want 90-degree corners on there. So just kind of working on the kind of edge corner itself. A little 90-degree corner. And just kind of finessing that. Just softening those square blocky edges. So we talked about the reason we're not carving both sides, and that is because as I carved the neck groove in here, if I did the same on the opposite side, there would only be just a tiny little bit of that soapstone holding this carving together, and it would be prone to breakage. Now, I have broken a few carvings in the last 15 years, and when I do happen to break one, I stop immediately. I take my broken pieces out of the water, and I set them off to dry. Once they have dried, I'll take a look at the broken pieces that I have, and I'll see how they fit together. If they fit back together perfectly, it's a nice clean break. I can just apply super glue to one side, like Gorilla Glue, squeeze the pieces together, let the glue cure or dry, and I can continue carving. But if those two contact pieces, if I grind them together too much, they might not bond or join together as neatly. You might end up with like a little missing gap of missing stone. And if I have that little missing gap of stone, what I'll do when the carving is dry is I'll scrub some rock away from an area where I know I want to shape it, but I'll take the dust and I'll mix that dust with the super glue so that when I add it all together, the dust-filled glue will fill that missing void. And because I'm using the same stone dust from the same rock, that color should match quite well. So that's a great way to do a quick repair on this particular stone. So I do enjoy carving the loon or the duck. It's pretty fun. Pretty quick shape to do actually as well. Now to create a little extra depth, I'm also going to carve the tail feather of my duck down a little bit just to help create a little extra ridge line on the wing itself. So it's a little extra depth on this shape. All right. Not a lot, just a little. Just enough to kind of grip that with a fingernail again, right? So not too much. Because I don't want to make that tail feather area too thin because it would just want to snap right off, right? We don't want that. We can round the back of the duck over onto the other side if you want to. We can round it. So we get a nice domed back. And you could also do that with the head as well. Just to really add to that round effect, right? Nice doming effect. Double checking my carving right now, moving it around slowly. Double checking that I have a nice rounded look on the head of the duck or the loon. Now I'm just going to double check, make sure that my beak is fairly consistent for thickness all the way around. I don't want to make my beak too thin. Pretty close right now. Double checking, looking for any of those tooling marks. Not really seeing any right now, so it looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to kind of see any really aggressive spots where I was carving into and just try and even those out so it's not a deep, deep gouge where I was carving. It's just a nice transition from the wing into the neck of the duck. Rounding off the chest. Following that right underneath towards the tail feathers of the animal as well. That's pretty good. I like that. Not bad. So once I have my shape carved the way that I like it, and I've ensured that I've gotten rid of all my tooling marks, I can get ready for sandpaper number 2. And even though it's not the last sanding step, it really is my favorite. It's where we really start to kind of change the overall texture of our stone, and we really start to see the natural colors that are hiding in there as well. So I'm going to take sandpaper 1. I'm going to tap the water out of there inside my bucket. I'm just going to set that off to the side. Sandpaper 2 in those sanding packs. We can look at the numbers on the back. This is a 320 grit, even has the number 2 right on there. That's a great way for us to remember that it is sanding stage number 2. We're going to make sure that we scrub our stone with the black grit side, not the blue paper side, all right? All the sandpapers are made for the water, so I get that wet to begin with. And usually when I start to smooth it out, I start with the flat side that I didn't do any shaping on whatsoever, because it's going to be the easiest side to smooth out quickly. And we can just lay our sandpaper there and scrub. Making sure we cover as much of that surface as we can. However, sandpaper number 2 is about 5 times smoother than sandpaper 1, so it's going to clog up about 5 times faster. So I do a lot more rinsing with sandpaper number 2 and 3, just to really try and keep that sandpaper nice and clean and nice and effective. When I do rinse it though, with sandpaper 2 and 3, one thing I don't do is I make sure I don't scrub the bottom of my bin after I've completed with sandpaper number 1. Because as we use this first sandpaper, when we fold it up and we shape and we fold it up and we scrub and we refold and scrub and move it back and forth, we're actually going to lose some grit from the surface of the fabric, and it's going to fall down to the bottom of your bin. And if you're scrubbing your soft soapstone across those little jagged bits, you can guarantee they're going to be putting scratches back into your carving. I typically give my flat side 20 scrubs. I rinse it. I'll give it another 20 scrubs, and then I'll rinse it. And I'll do this 3 times, and then I'll stop and take a look at it. You should notice a difference The surface should be quite shinier, right, as it reflects the light, but also the texture as well. The texture should be quite smooth right now. What I'm looking for with sandpaper number 2 is I want to make sure that any of the scratches that I left behind with sandpaper number 1 are gone. I want a nice smooth surface on my carving right now. With sandpaper number 2 and 3, we can also fold these up. Just make sure that black grit is on the outside. You can use that, tuck it into those hard to reach areas, so you can just try and do the best job sanding everywhere. You will be able to do a little bit of shaping with sandpaper 2 as well, although I will say that the shaping is much easier to do with sandpaper number 1. If I go to sandpaper number 2 and I perhaps see gray stripes from the bandsaw, like some tooling marks or something along the thinner edges, or if I have some deeper scratches that I don't want, I might go back to sandpaper number 1 quickly and scuff over those areas just to make them easier to erase with sandpaper number 2. And how do we know that we're ready for the third sanding stage? Well, sandpaper 3 does not get rid of scratches. It does not do any shaping at all. All it's going to do is just smooth that existing surface that we have. So all the scratches that I don't want to see, they should be gone before I go to sandpaper number 3. That's why sandpaper 1 does all the hard work. Sandpaper 2 starts to smooth it out. And then number 3 just kind of glasses up that surface that we have and just really helps kind of add that real final shine to the piece of stone as well. Push, 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 right? And if you're not sure if the stone might be a solid color and you're having a tough time to tell whether or not you've sanded it or not, use texture, feel it. Where I've sanded it, it's quite smooth. Where I haven't, it's still quite coarse, quite rough. So you can always use texture as well to tell if you've sanded that area or not. I'm just going to open this up. So that way I can actually carve not only the chest, but also underneath the beak at the same time. I'm going to sand 2 spots simultaneously. Lots of rinsing. Take a look. Looking for any scratches I don't want. Everything's looking all right. Move on. All the way down the back. And again, some of those scratches could be really quite fine. Make sure you're doing lots of rinsing. That iron that we were talking about, those tiny little spots of iron, as we're sanding with sandpaper 2 and 3, we might actually dislodge or knock that iron out. And then if we don't rinse consistently, we could just end up scrubbing that piece of iron across the surface of our soapstone. And that iron would 100% be putting scratches back into your carving. I'm just going to make sure I'm being nice and thorough with sandpaper number 2. I like to also fold this up a number of times, making sure that black grit is on the outside. You can really tuck that into those hard to reach areas. My fingers don't fit, just do the best job possible, right? So how do I know if I'm ready for sandpaper number 3? Well, I want to make sure that all the scratches that I do not want are gone. I want to make sure that there's no tooling marks left behind. I want to make sure that I'm done my shaping for sure. And if I feel like I've accomplished everything I want on the particular shape, I can go to sandpaper 3. And if you did a good job with sandpaper number 1, not only shaping it, but just leaving a consistent texture all over that stone, it's actually going to make the use of sandpaper 2 easier. And then once you've actually gotten rid of all the scratches that you don't want, if you did a great job doing that, sandpaper 3 is actually the quickest sanding stage there is. It's just a quick once over. That's all it is. I don't really see any scratches on there. I'm just kind of double checking, make sure the head's still nice and round. Just kind of rounding off the opposing side, just so it really curves over the back. Really rounds those out, right? Any little corners in there, that's usually where some of the tooling marks will really hide. So that's why I also like to fold my sandpaper up, really tuck it in there, really try and be as effective as possible when I'm sanding with sandpaper number 2. Still using that thumb technique, just kind of scrubbing it everywhere. I think I'm pretty happy with it. I think I like that. So now that I'm finished with sandpaper number 2, I go to sandpaper number 3. And the final sanding stage is a 600 grit. The biggest number goes last. 600 grit. All the sandpapers are made for the water, so again, I'm going to get this wet first. Again, making sure I'm using the black grit side. Let's start with that flat, uncarved side first, because it's going to be the easiest to do. And if we did a nice consistent job with sandpaper 2, this should be pretty quick. Oof, pretty smooth. That feels pretty amazing. I like it. Again, pretty shiny. Pretty smooth, almost twice as smooth as sandpaper 2. So that's also why it's so important that we get rid of all the marks we don't want, because with us just getting smoother and smoother stages of sandpaper, any shaping gets harder and harder to do with those softer, smoother pieces of sandpaper. Fold it up again, black grit out, tuck it into those hard to reach areas. I'm just trying to do the best I can. So some of my students ask me, well, why don't I just spend an hour on sandpaper number 2, David, and just make this ultra smooth? Unfortunately, the sanding doesn't work that way. Your stone is only going to get so soft. And it's primarily based on 2 factors. Number 1, how hard is your stone? Remember, the harder stones take a better polish. So if I had a really hard soapstone, I should have a pretty smooth piece of rock right now. The second determining factor is going to be the consistency that you had with sandpaper number 1 and 2. If you did a good job shaping it with sandpaper 1 and then smoothed it out really, really well with sandpaper 2, sandpaper 3 will be quite fast. And it will actually do a pretty good job smoothing it, but it's only going to do so much, right? It's only going to go so far. If we were carving a harder rock, we would probably go to finer and finer stages. But you should find the sanding stages that are in these kits quite effective, actually, at doing some shaping and polishing these rocks as well. So it's a little bit tougher to tell just by feeling it if you've gotten over it with sandpaper number 3. So you might just want to use a visual a little bit more with sandpaper number 3. And just double check and see. Should be nice and shiny, really quite smooth. If you feel any little coarse bits at all, you know, maybe just run that over a few times with sandpaper number 3. And the very, very final step in these kits will be an oil, be a tongue oil, these little vials here. But because it's an oil, we cannot use that while these stones are wet. So when I've completely finished my carving and I'm done all 3 sanding stages and I'm happy with my carving, I will take it and rinse it in clean water. I want this dusty water off of this carving. I'm going to let that sit and dry overnight. I want to make sure it's nice and dry. The reason I let it sit for a day is because those softer pieces of soapstone, they're almost like a sponge. They're going to soak that water up. So the outside might look dry, but sometimes there's still some trapped moisture inside. So that's why I typically like to wait for 1 day before I do the oiling. And as far as a rinse goes, just a quick rinse underneath some clean water. Doesn't need to be hot or warm, whatever's comfortable for you. You do not need any soap. It just needs a quick rinse, just to make sure that there's no dust stuck on that rock itself. That's really all it needs. Really rounding that off. Just double checking, see if I need to go back anywhere, do anything again. You know what? Feels pretty good. I like that. I've got a nice wing protruding up from the side. You can see how it's got a little bit of a step there, right? Some depth on there. A nice neckline. And then the beak is a little bit narrower, so the cheek of my duck is also sticking out a little bit. I'm pretty happy with this. I'm going to go give this a quick rinse and let this dry before I finish with the oiling process. All right. Okay, so here we have our finished duck or loon. Nice and dry. Just got a little paper towel. I'm going to use the oil that's in there in that little vial with that Q-tip. And we're going to start to seal the color out on our stone. So we pop that open. And then I usually start with just the flat side that I didn't do any shaping on at all. And I only work on oiling just that flat side. We can really see that color starting to pop. Looking great. Just a light coating is really all this needs right now. So now that I have this side, I can just use fingers, grab it from the edges. I'm just going to flip this over, and now I can continue and finish oiling the rest of my carving, including all these edges. Just trying to be nice and thorough and making sure I get this oil everywhere, all over this stone. It's just a tung oil, T-U-N-G, a tree oil from Australia that we use. Nothing super fancy. And it is all included in the kits that we sell, just to make it more successful and easier for you to accomplish your carvings as well. Just really being thorough, right? Turn this whole stone around, look at from every single angle. I want to make sure I didn't miss any little spots at all. And in these vials, we typically get about 2 coatings for these particular carvings. Although for the harder stone, we do find that 1 coating does quite well. For those softer rocks, you might find that the first coating is kind of soaked up a little bit, and then it might actually want that second coat. All right. All right. Pretty happy with that. It looks pretty good. So I'm going to let this sit for about 2 hours before I wipe it off with this paper towel. All right, so I'm going to let that sit for a little bit. And here we have the finished small soapstone loon or duck. I hope you enjoyed this class as much as I did. Feel free to join us on our social media platforms for other tips and tricks. And if you want to stay up to date with all the other videos that we have available, also subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Thanks everybody. My name is David Swinowski with Rubble Road Soapstone. Hope you had some fun carving today.